Right. Okay, so as I had planned to teach a class today, I'm going to record this. It doesn't matter how many people we have in front of their screens, but um, I wanted to make this lesson anyway because I'm not sure I'll be able to teach next week, especially at the end of the week. So whatever happens, I will leave this for you to rewatch, and that's why it's being recorded on a holiday. So that's it. Um, this specific lesson is going to be about um, the um, question of democratization in Europe. In the previous class, in the previous lesson, we had seen that new states were created in Europe, and that these new states, and that was mostly about Germany and Italy, these new states were the creation of a kind of, a triple conjunctions of things. Firstly, the fact that you had this national feeling, and that was the development of nationalism, as development of an imaging community and national feeling. Secondly, the fact that behind this national feeling you had some form of imperial or imperialistic projects, and that was especially the case for Germany. Another way to put it would be to say that national feelings and nationalism was used as a tool also for building for the projects of building new empires, and if you remember, that was the case for Bismarck especially. Finally, the third point that enabled the creation of these new states was that for some powers in Europe, especially France, I mentioned Napoleon III's project, supporting the construction of new countries, namely Italy, was also a way to gain influence in Europe, and it was used as kind of diplomatic strategy. Okay, so the period between 1848 and 1870 was a period of rise of nationalism, building new states, state building, and state enlargement, and also basically um, having these national identity, national construction being at the heart of diplomatic games and exchanges. Okay, so that was the plan. Um, Now the second explanation, the second lesson is more about hello to the people coming, right? I'm pleased you're here even on a holiday. Thanks for this. Um, Today I would like to start moving on to the second part, and the second part is more about the rise of democracy, not the rise, but the enlargement of democracy in Europe. You remember that the aim of all this lesson is also to, understand what type of war World War One was. And at some point during World War One, there would be a real confrontation, especially in propaganda, that would make World War One a war for civilization. And when the French or the British used the notion of civilization, they also referred to how more democratic and how freer they were compared to Germany, or compared to the Ottoman Empire, or compared to the Austrian Empire. And so this second part, so that's part two, European politics between democratization and authoritarianism, um, is a part where I study how France and the UK, on the one hand, set up reforms that made them more democratic and granting more rights to their population. Okay. Then in a second part, I will move on to see that in some regimes in Europe there was no evolution. In Germany, there was an evolution to a parliamentary regime, but that remained an empire with a strong emperor. In Austria or Russia, okay, absolutism remained. And finally, we'll see that at the end of the 19th century, more states were created and that they balanced between democracy and authoritarianism. Okay, and for the next weeks, we'll be studying the March to War, and that's part three. Okay, so I think it's good if we start by the United Kingdom, as it's class for an international section. So today I'm not going to teach you, hello everybody, hello to the people coming, right? So I hope that's clear for you. I hope that this presentation is clear. Today, so let's make things clear. The aim is not to teach a full lesson on how the UK became a democracy. Firstly, because we're supposed to spend, in the official syllabus, we're supposed to spend something like 0 minute, no minute at all, on how the UK became more democratic. Even in the international section, we're not supposed to spend that much time on the question. So what I've decided to do, rather than teach a lesson on how the UK became more democratic, is firstly to compare the way it happened in the UK and in France. Okay, so we have a comparison between two countries, one being a monarchy and one eventually becoming a republic. That's the first point. Secondly, it's more about how the UK gave more capacity to vote, enabled more people to vote, while not claiming to be a democracy. There is a very famous quotation and phrase by Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, she ruled from 1837 to 1901. Okay, she ruled for 64 years, 1837 to 1901. And she said, I will never be a democratic queen. Okay, I will never be the queen of a democratic monarchy. So she was not willing, and actually very few people in the UK were willing to make the UK a real democracy. So I'm going to focus on 3 moments. These 3 moments are called, firstly, the Chartist moment. And the Chartist moment refers to a movement, Chartism, which was both a movement to give more vote to more people, and also a movement that would be allied to the workers' movement. So that's where the connection is. This movement organized so as to have more people voting in the UK. So I will start from here and from their first petition, their first text, dating back to 1837. Secondly, we will see that in 1867, there was something called the Second Reform Act. It gave the vote to most men in the UK. But what is quite interesting is that the Prime Minister of that time, Benjamin Disraeli, made sure that giving the vote to more people would not make the UK a democracy. He talked about popular suffrage, but not democracy. Finally, I will try to have a look at a major question: male suffrage enlarged, but what about women suffrage? And I'm going to talk about the suffragist movement, sometimes known as the suffragettes movement, right? But suffragist is more neutral and less derogatory. Okay, so 3 moments today. I will spend, I would say, 10 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes on each question. And so what you have to know first, and this is where I'm starting. So I'm going back to the structure of the lesson again. So it's paragraph 2. We agree on this. Paragraph 2, European politics between democratization and authoritarian regimes. And it's part 1, paragraph 1, democratic projects in Europe, the UK and France, enlarge suffrage and strengthen democratic institutions. And that was maybe truer for France. Okay? So, to start with the UK, so it could be A if you want, right? It could be the first point, a first bullet point. You need to understand that the United Kingdom at the beginning of the 19th century was not democratic at all. It was a parliamentary regime. And this parliamentary regime had a sovereign, a king or queen. In 1837, it would become Queen Victoria, a new queen. It had a House of Commons, which is a parliament, a house where people were elected. Okay? The House of Commons would be the equivalent of Assemblée Nationale, a place for representatives, a place for people being elected by in what you call a constituency. The word will be in the next text we study. And a constituency is a place, it's a local place where people are elected. Okay, the French equivalent is circonscription. But actually, at the beginning of the 19th century, only a tiny minority of people could vote. And the reason for this is that there was something called a franchise. Okay, so you can actually pronounce in various way. Okay, various ways. Some say franchise, but franchise is the proper is a correct pronunciation. What is that? What is this? It's a money. It's a tax, which you have to pay. It's a revenue you need to have to be able to vote. Okay, the franchise is, are you wealthy enough to vote? So you certainly know the expression in France. Okay, you can call this suffrage censitaire to some extent. And so what does that mean? It means that at the beginning of the 19th century in the UK, less than 10% of the men could vote. So if you consider that women represented half the population, it means that less than 5% of the population could vote. Who could vote? People from the nobility, from the land nobility, and people from the rising bourgeoisie. Okay? That's it. But as you know, the early 19th century was the moment in the UK when you had a rising working class. I'm not going to insist on this once more. I'm sure you know this right now. So there was a rising working class. That means that more and more people were actually involved in creating wealth for the UK, in creating a strong economy in the UK. And these people that took part in building this strong economy were deprived from the voting rights. And this is what gave way to the first movement I'm going to study, which is called the Chartist movement. Chartism, so here we are. So what were the Chartists in the United Kingdom? It was an organization, you can call it a grassroots organization. It started from local assemblies of people willing to enlarge the suffrage. And so in 1837, and the date is not by chance, I've just told you that was the year when Queen Victoria came to the throne. So there was a change in sovereign, and the context was the context of a growing and fastly growing industrialization. This is what the Chartists demanded. This is what the people that signed this text wanted. And as you can see, there were 6 major points. Firstly, a vote for every man 21 years of age, of sound mind, so not the crazy people, not the people who had psychological or mental problems, and not undergoing punishment for crime. So, what they wanted was universal suffrage for all men, save for those who were in prison, who were in jail, and those who were maybe in a psychiatric institutions or identify as mentally ill. This is exactly what you call universal suffrage or universal male suffrage. Okay? That's what they wanted. As you can see, no woman, clearly. The Chartist movement did not defend the women's suffrage. Secondly, the ballot. What is the ballot? It's a hidden vote. You go to the ballot box, you have a curtain, and you draw the curtain, and so you can vote secretly. And that was done to protect the elector in the exercise of his vote. Why? Because before you had public votes. It means that people would gather in assemblies, right, in like a meeting, a local meeting, and they would raise their hands to vote. And you know what happens when you raise your hand to vote? It means that people know what you vote for, who you vote for, and so they may look for influencing, right? They may look to influence your vote. So they said, if we give the right to vote to the working class, like, a factory worker, we have to make sure that the boss, the owner of the factory, won't be here to pressure the voter. Thirdly, no property qualification for members of parliament. What does that mean? It means that if you wanted to be elected as a member of parliament, there was no condition of wealth. You didn't have to be a proprietor, you didn't have to be a factory owner, you didn't have to be a land owner, you didn't have to be your home owner to be elected. And look at what they say. Then the constituency, the place where you're elected, can return to men of their choice to be rich or poor. So it was a way to abolish the wealth gap between the people that were elected. Payment of members. Like when you're a member of parliament, you should be paid. Why? Because before, you were not paid when you were a member of parliament. So who would go there? People who were in capacity to leave their activity without risking their wealth. That means, once again, either the wealthiest people and the nobles. Even when you were a bourgeois from the trading bourgeoisie, you could not go to the parliament because as a bourgeois, you had an activity and you didn't have full free time. So, for people who are in the spécialité HGGSP, the Greeks invented this. In Athens, there was something called a mistos, which was exactly this. When people came to vote, they would be given some money so that even the poor people could stop their job and their activity for one day and get a revenue from from taking part to democracy. I'm moving on for the next two conditions. Equal constituencies. Securing the same amount of representation for the same number of electors, instead of allowing small constituency to swamp the vote of large ones. Actually, in the UK, some members of parliament represented more people than the others. That was another problem, but I won't develop on this. Finally, annual parliaments. Parliaments should be elected on a regular basis. Why? To make sure you can check the members of parliament and make sure they're not corrupt, bribed, being given money to, that they're not pressured or intimidated, etc., etc. So the aim was to say, we need a more democratic Britain. We need more people voting, all the men. We need everybody to be being able to be elected. We want everybody to have an access to parliament and be able to check what's going on in Parliament. So, can I put this differently? We want Parliament to be more representative of the British people. Okay? So, the Chartist movement can be seen as the first mass movement in favor of democratization of the United Kingdom. Okay? And it had a very long-term impact on both political parties in the UK, especially political parties that were willing to reform the UK, but also on the workers' movement, because you remember when I presented you with socialism, I've told you that you had two branches. People that were more willing maybe to reform the conditions of workers, and people who were willing to be more revolutionary and totally change the system. The Chartist movement would highly influence the Labour Party in the UK. The Labour Party being the Socialist Party in the UK. The Labour Party in the UK would never ever be a revolutionary movement. Okay, contrarily to what happened in Germany, contrarily to what happened in France, contrarily to what happened in the USSR, in Russia, with the Bolsheviks and so on. In the UK, the Labour Party would always be more about reform than revolution. And one reason for this is that it had roots in this charter. Okay? So the Chartists starting having mass demonstrations. They also were very involved in the Spring of Nations, because their ideas of democratization also influence other European peoples. Though they did not obtain immediate results, because as you can see, their first petition was published in 1837. Another version, a revised version, would come later, called the People's Charter. It would take approximately the First World War, okay, to have these demands taken into account. But in 1867, there was a first reform. Was that clear what the Chartists were willing to do? Please, I know that you may not be that numerous behind your screens, but if you have any question, right, please do not hesitate if you think it was not clear. Okay? No question? Okay, do not hesitate to put some even later on. So now, second moment that you should know. So you should know about Chartism and what it was. A mass movement which was willing to promote more democratic parliament in the UK. If you remember what I've told you about the workers' movement and socialism, many conservative people who were not willing to give more rights to the workers, they were worried anyway. And their concern was that the amount of workers was growing. And more workers meant more social trouble. One possible way to calm down the risk of social unrest was to improve the working conditions of the workers. Another solution was to give some workers the right to vote, so that the working class could be told, okay, you have complaints? There are things you want to improve? Okay, just vote. Elect your own representative, elect your own members of parliament, and maybe your voice will be listened to, and maybe there will be improvement for you in the parliament, with new laws, with new acts, with new reforms being made. Okay? Among those who promoted this was a man called Benjamin Disraeli, depending on the pronunciation. And this speech is very interesting. It's long. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it and explain the whole of it. But it's very interesting because the guy defended, the Prime Minister, not the guy, he defended an extension, a larger extension of suffrage. Okay? And in this text, in a speech he made in the House of Commons, so in front of the other members of Parliament in the UK, he would defend the fact that the best way for the UK not to become fully democratic, that the best way for democracy not to be established in the UK was to give more voters the right to vote. And how did he explain this paradox? So I propose we read this. I'm going to read this text, okay? And by reading this, I would like you to understand that giving more people the right to vote was a strategy to calm down. I mean, in the UK, can I say this more brutally? In France, since the French Revolution, you had many people, not among the most conservative, but you had a large sector of the political world that thought that it was morally okay and politically better to establish universal suffrage. And that democracy through republicanism, having a French republic and republicanism, was a goal in itself. So the more republican France would be, the more democratic France would be, the more people would vote, the better in itself. In the UK, it was a different movement. It was more about, do we really have a choice? It's like when you boil water. There is a moment, right? You need to remove the top because otherwise, you will have a problem. In the UK, it was more seen like this. We have this social trouble, right? You've got this agitation coming. Maybe we should give more rights to some voters so they will, calm down. They will relax. In France, going to universal suffrage was mostly seen as a way to achieve the revolution, complete the revolutionary movement. In the UK, it was more, okay, we have to make do with this. You see? Okay, look at this. It's a bit caricatural what I'm saying, okay? I'm not saying France was perfect. No, that the UK was only cynical, but that was globally it. Let's read this. The House of Commons, Prime Minister Disraeli said, has combined national representation with the attributes of a Senate. That peculiar union has, in our opinion, been owing to the variety of elements of which it's formed. Its variety of character has given to it its deliberative power, and it owes to its deliberative power its general authority. What does that mean? It means that the House of Commons is not a place to represent all the people of the UK. It's about deliberative power. It's a place where we discuss. After all, what is a parliament? It's coming from the Norman language, the French language. A parliament is a place where you speak. Parlement Parliament, House of Commons, doesn't mean democracy. It's a place where some people in charge of laws, gather and discuss. And so, you know what I mean? You see the difference? We're not talking about representation. We're talking about debate. Right? Okay, sorry for this. You want a comparison? Think of a conseil de classe. You know what I mean? It's a deliberative place. I mean, we discuss. Okay, people come with their own opinions and so on. Some were elected. The parents' representatives are elected. Your delegate class delegates are elected, but the other people are not. Okay? Now, I'm not elected as a teacher. The provisor is not elected and so on. So, but it's still a place of debate. It's still a place of deliberation. And so I think many people in the UK, especially the most conservative people, consider that it was better if the parliament could remain like this. A place of debate, not necessarily a place of representation, right? And national election. Yes, of course. To answer your question, Kenzo, right? This fear of a growing, the fear of a growing influence by the lower classes. When I say the lower classes, these are not my words, of course. These are the bourgeoisie and the nobility in France still at that time. What I mean is that in France, can I say this differently if you prefer? In France, the French Revolution had put the question, had put a light on the question of universal suffrage from the start. Okay? During the French Revolution, the revolutionaries had considered that the norm was universal suffrage, universal male suffrage, until Olympe de Gouges and other female revolutionaries and let's call them feminist revolutionaries would wonder what would be the role of women in this. But in the UK, this question was not discussed before, as I've told you, the 1840s and 50s. So I'm not saying that in France there was no resistance to universal suffrage. Of course, the Restauration in France, the charter that was signed by the restored kings, right? Charles X, Louis XVIII, Charles X, and so on, right? That was a resistance to universal suffrage, and that was a restoration, as it's called. But remember, in 1848 in France, when Louis-Philippe had to abdicate and there was a revolution, universal suffrage was given immediately. And Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, that's for next week, but Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, when he was elected the president of the Second Republic in France, he was elected on universal suffrage in 1848. At a moment in the UK when that was not even a question, as we're going to see here. Because a parliament in France was now called l'Assemblée nationale. And l'Assemblée nationale is a place to represent the nation. And since the French Revolution, what is a nation? It's a community of citizens. So if you represent the nation, you have to represent the whole of it. In the UK, you don't have to represent a nation. You have to debate to take decision. You see, I'm not saying it's not democratic at all. I'm just saying that democracy was not the aim of the British Parliament. Okay? I don't know if I've answered your question or put some more light on your question. So, can we go back to line 4? We wish, the House of Commons and the government, we wish, I repeat, not only to maintain, but to strengthen that deliberative character and functions. And we believe that in the present age, 1867, the age of industrialization, the end of a larger middle class, larger working class, in the present age and under the existing circumstances of the country, the best way to do so is to establish them on a broad, popular basis. I know that there are some persons in whose minds the epithet which I have just used, popular, may create a feeling of distrust. Wow, give the people the right to decide. But I attribute the sentiment of alarm which is associated with it to a misapprehension of its meaning. Disraeli was saying, when I say popular, you hear the wrong word. It's the perplexity of idea which too often confounds popular privileges with democratic rights. Okay, be reassured, you people from the elite. I will give the vote to more people, but I won't make a democracy. Popular and democratic are not identical. They're not similar. More than that, he said, they're contrary. Popular privileges are consistent with a state of society in which there is great inequality of condition. At no time, at no moment would the government in the UK in the 1860s try to attack inequalities, and not inequalities in social and economic states. Democratic rights, on the contrary, demand that there should be equality of condition as the fundamental basis of the society which they regulate. So you see here that giving the right to vote to more people did not mean making sure that that inequalities of condition would be reduced. Can I put this differently? Can I say what Disraeli had in mind? Giving more people the right to vote will be a way for us to make sure that we keep our economic and social privileges. Let's abandon a bit of our political privileges, of our political advantages, so we can maintain the other inequalities. That's exactly what he's saying. I mean, I'm not inventing, right? That's exactly what its point of view was. If we go a bit at the bottom of the text, you have a quotation which goes, "We do not, however, live, and I trust it will never be the fate of this country to live under a democracy." The propositions which I'm going to make tonight certainly have no tendency in that direction. Generally speaking, I would say that looking to what has occurred since the Reform Act of 1832 was passed, the increase of population, the progress of industry, the spread of knowledge, and our ingenuity in the arts, we are of opinions that number, thoughts, and feelings have since that time been created, which it is desirable should be admitted within the circle of the Constitution. What does that mean? Last sentence. If the measure I'm going to pass bears some reference to existing classes in this country, you see, it's not only a Marxist word. Why should we conceal, why should we hide from ourselves the fact that this country is a country of classes, and a country of classes it will ever remain? That's exactly what I've just told you. Let's create, this is exactly what they were trying to do. Let's give the vote to more people. Why? Because we need to do that, because more and more people are coming from the middle class, are coming from the lower class, are coming from the working class, and there is a risk these people in the UK get angry at the elite, at the upper classes, at the nobility, at the gentry, at the upper bourgeoisie. If we don't give them some rights, if we don't let them participate to the national debate, there are risks of higher tensions. But if we provide them with these rights, we will also calm them down. We will also make sure that we can control what is being said by their elected members. And that's a way to prevent us from having to give them more economic and social rights. This country is a country of classes, The UK is what we call a class-ridden society, okay? And a country of classes, it will ever remain. Let's give political rights so the economic, social situation of the working class does not change too much and we don't reduce the inequalities. Okay? So, what would that result in? It would result in a law passed by the House of Commons called the Second Reform Act. And the consequence of this Second Reform Act is that it gave much more rights to voters. So, what were the major changes? Firstly, the ballot was introduced, the secret vote. It meant that now people could vote secretly. Before this reform, and you remember that's something the Chartists wanted, you would have to go to the place of voting. Can you imagine that? Imagine you have your local, polling box, the place ballot polling box where you vote. You do that today. I vote in a school just like a few meters away from home. A school where my kids were schooled, actually. That's the place where I vote. When I get into the voting place, I have a secret place to vote. Before in the UK, before 1867, I would have to go to this school and say, hey, look at me. That's my name. I'm M. Tavernier. And this is who I'm going to vote. And you had to say this publicly. Okay? So you can imagine how you could easily be influenced, or more than influenced, bribed. People would be, oh, you sure you want to vote for that man? Oh, look at this. Take this money, man. Now you know who you should vote for. So, the 1867 Reform Act introduced ballots much later than France. In France, in 1848, you had this already. Okay. Secondly, the Reform Act doubled the number of voters. Now you had 2 million voters, but 2 million voters in a country which was populated by almost 40 million people. Okay, so clearly it means that only a minority of people would still be voting. So you can't speak of a democracy. Actually, there would be other acts. I'm not going to give you the full list. What I want you to understand is that clearly in 1867, when this major Reform Act was passed, and Queen Victoria had been queen for 30 years, the UK was not marching to democracy at all. Only 2 million men could vote. Many men that were under a certain level of revenue would still be deprived of voting. The exact numbers will be in the lessons, okay? But today the aim is not to give you how much did you have to earn and so on. That's not the point. The point for you is to understand that it was very far from being a democratic regime, the UK in 1867. Globally, the men universal suffrage would come with World War I. The UK would have to wait until World War I to have all the limitation on male suffrage, but I'm going to discuss the women's situation right now. It would take World War I. So, if you can count, 50 years later. Okay? In the meantime, and that's something I want you to understand, once you were elected in the House of Commons, once you were elected in this parliament, you were absolutely free to speak. the House of Commons was a real place of liberty. The House of Commons was a real place of free speech. You see what I mean? It's like a club. Pushing the doors into the club was a tough thing to do because there were a lot of limitations on the vote. But once you were inside the club, once you were in the House of Commons, it was a real parliament. People could discuss and vote and pass laws. For example, the laws that restricted children working in factories in the UK was passed in this House of Commons. Okay? So what I mean is that, and the Reform Act that gave more people the right to vote was passed in the House of Commons. So I mean, it was a place where all subjects could be discussed, right? Most subjects could be discussed. The problem was that it was not democratic in the sense that, as Prime Minister Disraeli said it very well, not everybody could elect the people in the parliament, could elect the members of parliament. But once you were elected, speech was free and debate was real. Now, for the remaining 10 minutes, let's look at a blind spot of this question. And the blind spot, of course, is women. Right. Sorry. Actually, sometimes it's a question I have a lot of time. Why did it take the UK so long to give women the right to vote, though sovereigns in the UK could be female sovereigns, could be queens? What I mean is that in France, for example, you could find it logical not to give women the right to vote even in a republic. Because in France, in the previous monarchy, the one that was abolished by the French Revolution, then restored, then abolished again, only kings could rule. It's something called la loi salique in France, which is that only male descendants or male heirs can take power. Not in the UK. In the UK, you had Elizabeth I, you had Mary, you had Mary Stuart, right? And you had Queen Victoria, and today Elizabeth II. So you have to know that Queen Victoria was not a feminist at all, right? She was everything but a feminist, right? I mean, she was a very conservative person for herself, right? And clearly, she never promoted the cause of women in terms of election. Firstly, because she was not in favor of democracy, and even less democracy for women. But the question that came from the rise of the working class, like we have more and more factory workers, and that's going to be a problem. So we should give them a right to vote, or a limited right to vote, or a right to be represented in the parliament. But among the working class, you had a lot of women. We've already said this, that many workers were actually female workers in the factories, with actually lower pays, lower revenues, more precarious conditions, but actually more and more women were playing active roles. And in the middle class and in the bourgeoisie, a movement in favor of women suffrage developed. So the opponents to this movement called it suffragette because, you know, the ed suffix refers to it being a female movement, right? Like you say, majorette, and so on. It's better if you call them the suffragists. That is, those who were like the Chartists. Okay, suffragists is those who defend the right for women to vote, all men and women. Just for today, if you're okay with that, I won't tell you everything about this because I will reuse it when we study the March to War and the role of women during the war in the UK. But I love this document. Postcards have always been a very popular way of promoting political ideas in the UK, right? Because postcards were, as there was freedom of mail, you could say things in postcards or letters that couldn't be said otherwise. So as you can see, this is a 1910, so we're at the beginning of the period, a 1910 suffragette postcard, and it's showing the paradox, the contradiction, and the silliness of the situation in the UK at that time. What a woman may be, and yet not vote. So at the top, you've got everything a woman, every role a woman could play in the British society, while still being deprived of the right to vote. At the bottom, you had all the conditions men could be or have been in and still remain electors and voters. So of course it's full of moral judgment, right? It's using moral values. For example, let's start, if you prefer. Let's start from the right hand side. A woman could be a factory hand, so someone working in the factory. And maybe you can recognize, the chain and tools and so on. And you can see that she's in a poor condition. She's a destitute woman. Okay? When you're a factory hand, it means you create wealth on a daily basis. You participate to the wealth of the nations, as Adam Smith would have said. But she couldn't vote. In the meantime, this man, a drunkard, so certainly not someone certainly not someone trustworthy, he could vote. She works hard, she can't vote. He's into drinking and so on. He's not reliable and he can vote. Well, how unfair. Another example. You can be a nurse. So you take care of sick people. You give a huge service. You serve the nation and you can't vote. You are lunatic. You're crazy. You're sick. You're the one who needs the person above. Because when you're lunatic, when you're crazy, when you have psychiatric problems, you need the help of the nurse. She can't vote. You can, because in 1910, a limitation on these psychiatric illnesses had disappeared. Okay? You are the mother of many kids. You are the person that, as you can see, pass the torches. The torch you can see in the background, that's bringing the lights and bringing the warmth of a household and so on, of a home. You raise kids. What a responsibility this is. You can't vote. You are the proprietor of white slaves. So white slaves actually can mean two things. Either you're a proprietor of a factory, that's the euphemistic version. Either you're a proprietor of a factory and you have all these poor women working there and you can vote. But white slave was also sometimes a euphemism for prostitution. Okay? So you're immoral, but you can vote. So, of course, that was also a key inequality. And in the United Kingdom, organization would start gathering under the supervision of some bourgeois women, most of them. The working class also organized, and one of the most famous was called the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, with a woman called Emmeline Pankhurst. And these women would be called the suffragettes, or nicknamed the suffragettes. And their claimed for women to get the right to vote, which they did not obtain before World War One. So it would take the end of World War One, it would take the post-World War One period for women to get the right to vote. But until World War One, the situation of women remained the same. No right to vote. I just would like to conclude, and I swear I'm done with this, by another document, which is an anti-suffragette poster, which has a wonderful pun on it. Great suffrage demonstration. So it means it's supposed to be a demonstration, a meeting for the suffragettes, that a meeting for women claiming for the right to vote. And as you can see, women are represented as geese. So I don't know what's your image of a goose as an animal, but it's not really a compliment to call a woman a goose. You know what geese do? They speak very loud. And they say nothing, because I don't know if you've ever understood what a goose says, but they speak very loud to say nothing at all. Plus, as you may know, they're very aggressive. Very, very aggressive. It's a very aggressive animal, right? If you've ever been pinched or attacked by a goose, you don't know, but okay. So it's very aggressive. It speaks loud to say nothing. And look at this. I've told you that the suffragette organization was called the Women's Social and Political Union. So here it's called the Goose Social and Political Union. And where is the pun? Is it a question of gender? What is a gender? It's a male goose. Okay, it's the animal which is the male in the goose species. So it's a play on word with gender. Is it a question of gender to stand between us and the vote? So it's a terrible pun, right? I'm not saying it's a great pun at all. And the woman speaking is nicknamed Miss Hissy. You know, hiss. That's the sound of a snake. The snakes hiss. So it's very unpleasant. You know, it's very difficult to... And you know what a snake is. You've read your Bible. You know what the snake does in the Bible, right? The snake is the one that brings evil to Adam and Eve. So you see, this is 100% sexism, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine something more misogynistic than this poster. But that's also to prove you that you had a strong resistance to women's suffrage in the UK. Not only in the upper classes, in the working class too, because maybe men in the working class were afraid to lose the only advantage they had as workers, which was to have the right to vote. Okay? So, I'm done for today because it's noon, so I think it's time you go back to your usual occupation. Right. I hope it was clear. But as you can see, as a conclusion for today, we could say that yes, there was an enlargement of suffrage in the UK from less than 5% of the population having the right to vote in the early 19th century to globally half the population being able to vote in 1914, men. Okay, and that was done through gradual reforms. Contrarily to France, you didn't have one revolution that gave the French people the right to vote, like the 1848 revolution. You didn't have this. In the UK, it was more gradual. But when World War I would start in 1940, the UK had more or less achieved universal male suffrage as France would. What I will do on next Monday, so if if you're okay with that, on Monday at 10, I will teach a class using my colleagues' hours. And then maybe it will be the last class we have as in distant teaching, because I don't know what's going to happen to us for the rest of the year. If I have to go back to school and teach classes, I won't be able to teach them on distant teaching. So I don't know. But next Monday, I'll be telling you about how France made a republic. Then this republic was replaced by an empire. And then eventually the defeat of Napoleon III led to the Third Republic and the building of a stronger democracy in France without women, because women would still be excluded from the vote until much later than in the UK, actually, until 1945. Right, people, I'm done. I hope that was clear and helpful to some point. Thank you for being here on a holiday. This video will remain for the other people who were not here, and that's fine. That's fine. And here we are. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care of yourselves, and meet you on next Monday. I'll send you a message to tell you how we organize for next week. Okay? Thanks a lot, people. It was a pleasure teaching the class. See you soon.